The crystalline spires of the galactic capital stretched toward 3 moons that hung like jewels in the purple twilight sky. Within the highest tower, the chamber of the Intergalactic Council hummed with the soft glow of holographic displays and the whispered conversations of delegates from 1,000 worlds. Lieutenant Commander Olivia Chen pressed herself against the maintenance shaft's cold metal walls, her heart hammering against her ribs. She shouldn't be here. The restricted access tunnels that honeycombed the council tower were off-limits to all but the highest security clearance personnel, and her rank certainly didn't qualify. But the encrypted message she'd intercepted 3 days ago had changed everything. Through the narrow ventilation grate, she could see into Chancellor Mordecai Thorne's private chambers. The man who had led the Intergalactic Council for the past decade sat hunched over an ancient tome, its pages seeming to absorb light rather than reflect it. Dark energy crackled around his fingers as he traced symbols that hurt to look at directly. Olivia bit back a gasp. Dark magic, the forbidden art that had nearly destroyed civilization during the Void Wars centuries ago, was supposed to be extinct. The Empire had spent generations hunting down every grimoire, every artifact, every practitioner. Yet here was the leader of the free galaxy, wielding powers that could unravel the very fabric of reality. The convergence approaches, Thorne murmured to the shadows that seemed to dance independently around him. Soon, the Empire's strength will become its weakness, and from its ashes, a new order will rise. The temperature in the maintenance shaft plummeted. Frost formed on the metal surfaces as something vast and terrible stirred in the darkness beyond the chamber. A voice like grinding stone and dying stars whispered back, "The Devourer grows restless, my servant. The barriers between dimensions weaken with each passing cycle. Complete the ritual, and your reward shall be beyond imagination." Olivia's training in xenopsychology had exposed her to many alien forms of communication, but this was something else entirely, something that bypassed the ears and spoke directly to the primal fear centers of the brain. Whatever Thorne was communing with, it wasn't from this universe. "I require more time," Thorne replied, his voice strained. The other council members grow suspicious. Senator Vex has been asking too many questions about the budget allocations to the Deep Space Research Division. "Time is a luxury you cannot afford," the entity hissed. "The prophecy speaks of one who will stand against the darkness. She draws near to the truth. Eliminate her before she can act." Olivia's blood turned to ice water. The prophecy? They were talking about someone specific, someone who posed a threat to whatever apocalyptic plan was unfolding. She pressed closer to the grate, straining to hear more. Thorne's laugh was bitter. "Lieutenant Commander Chen? She's a minor intelligence analyst with delusions of heroism. Her reports about anomalous energy readings in the Outer Rim have been ignored by her superiors. Do not underestimate her," the voice warned. "The threads of fate converge around her like a spider's web. She is the fulcrum upon which the future balances." The conversation continued, but Olivia had heard enough. Somehow, impossibly, she had stumbled into the center of a conspiracy that threatened the very existence of the Empire. Thorne wasn't just a traitor, he was in league with entities from beyond the dimensional barriers, planning to use dark magic to tear apart everything their ancestors had built. She began to inch backward through the maintenance shaft, moving with the careful silence her military training had ingrained. Every creak of metal, every whisper of air through the vents seemed impossibly loud. If Thorne discovered her presence now, she wouldn't live long enough to warn anyone. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Olivia emerged from the access panel in a service corridor 3 levels down. Her hands shook as she sealed the panel behind her and tried to process what she had witnessed. The most powerful man in the galaxy was preparing to destroy everything, and somehow, she was the only one who knew. But who would believe her? She was nobody, a mid-ranking officer in the intelligence corps with a reputation for chasing conspiracy theories and filing reports that her superiors routinely dismissed as overactive imagination. Claims about dark magic and interdimensional entities would only confirm their assessment that she was mentally unstable. No, she couldn't rely on official channels. If Thorne had infiltrated the highest levels of government, there was no telling how deep the corruption went. She would need to find allies outside the traditional power structure, people with their own reasons to oppose the Chancellor and the skills necessary to help her stop whatever nightmare he was planning to unleash. Olivia made her way through the tower's gleaming corridors, past murals depicting the Empire's greatest victories and monuments to fallen heroes. Citizens and officials moved with the quiet confidence of a civilization at peace, unaware that their leader was orchestrating their destruction. The weight of that knowledge sat on her shoulders like a physical burden. Her small apartment in the residential district felt different when she finally reached it. The familiar surroundings, the books scattered across every surface, the half-finished models of ancient starships, the photographs of her parents and younger brother back on New Terra, seemed fragile now, temporary. Everything she cared about was living on borrowed time. She activated her personal computer and began cross-referencing personnel files, looking for individuals who met specific criteria, exceptional skills, reasons to distrust the current power structure, and most importantly, clean records that suggested they hadn't been compromised by Thorn's influence. The list was depressingly short, but a few names stood out. Dr. Marcus Webb, formerly the Empire's leading expert on dimensional physics until his research into the Void Wars was classified and his security clearance revoked. He now worked as a private consultant, taking on projects that the military deemed too dangerous or impractical. Captain Sarah Rodriguez, a decorated Special Forces operative who had been court-martialed for refusing to follow orders during a classified mission in the Andromeda Cluster. The official records were heavily redacted, but reading between the lines suggested she had uncovered evidence of corruption and been silenced for it. HFY, a former member of the Arcane Inquisition, the Empire's specialized force for dealing with supernatural threats. According to his file, he had requested early retirement after becoming philosophically incompatible with departmental objectives. In other words, he had developed a conscience. It wasn't much of a team, but they were all she had. The question was whether any of them would believe her story, and more importantly, whether they would be willing to risk everything to stop a threat that most people thought was impossible. Olivia spent the rest of the night crafting carefully worded messages, each one tailored to its recipient's background and psychological profile. She couldn't reveal the full truth in written communications, too much risk of interception, but she could plant seeds of curiosity that might lead to face-to-face meetings. As dawn broke over the capital's skyline, painting the crystalline spires in shades of gold and amber, she sent the messages. 3 small data packets launched into the vast network of the galactic communication grid, carrying with them her desperate hope that somewhere out there, someone would listen. The die was cast. In a matter of hours, she would either begin building the coalition needed to save the Empire, or she would disappear into the same shadows that had claimed so many others who had gotten too close to dangerous truths. Either way, there was no turning back now. Dr. Marcus Webb's laboratory occupied the top 3 floors of a converted warehouse in the industrial district of Kepler Station, a sprawling space habitat orbiting the binary star system of Gemini. The walls were lined with equipment that most universities couldn't afford: dimensional resonance chambers, quantum field generators, and prototype devices that existed at the bleeding edge of theoretical physics. But it was the books that drew the eye. Thousands of volumes, some printed on traditional paper, others inscribed on crystalline memory matrices from extinct civilizations. Webb's collection of forbidden knowledge was supposedly the most comprehensive outside of the Imperial archives, though he would never admit that publicly. The physicist himself was hunched over a workbench, his graying hair disheveled and his eyes bloodshot from too many sleepless nights. The message from Lieutenant Commander Chen had arrived 18 hours ago, and he had been unable to concentrate on anything else since. Anomalous dimensional fluctuations in the outer rim, he muttered, adjusting the focus on his spectral analyzer. Energy signatures consistent with pre-imperial artifacts. Right. The readings she had attached to her message were genuine, he could tell that much from the quantum resonance patterns. But the implications were staggering. If Chen was correct, someone was actively experimenting with Void War-era technology, the kind of weapons that had nearly torn apart the fabric of space-time itself. A soft chime indicated an incoming transmission. Webb activated his communication array, and the holographic image of a woman in her early 30s materialized above his desk. She had the kind of lean, intense look that came from years of military service, but her eyes held an intelligence that spoke to deeper mysteries. "Dr. Webb, thank you for agreeing to speak with me," Olivia said without preamble. "I need to know, in your professional opinion, is it possible for someone to access Void War technology without triggering the Imperial monitoring systems?" Webb leaned back in his chair, considering. The question itself was treasonous. Possession of Void War artifacts carried a mandatory death sentence, but there was something about Chen's manner that suggested she wasn't asking out of idle curiosity. "Hypothetically speaking," he said carefully, "the monitoring systems are designed to detect specific energy signatures associated with known artifact types. But if someone had access to pre-Imperial research, the kind that was classified after the Void Wars ended, they might be able to modify the artifacts to operate below the detection threshold. And what would be the purpose of such modifications? That depends on what they were trying to accomplish. Void War technology was never about destruction for its own sake. It was about accessing power from other dimensions, other realities. The weapons were just the most obvious application." Olivia nodded grimly. What if someone was trying to weaken the barriers between dimensions? Not to create weapons, but to allow something through from the other side? The temperature in the laboratory seemed to drop several degrees. Webb had spent his career studying the theoretical underpinnings of dimensional physics, but he had always hoped that certain possibilities would remain purely academic. "If that were the case," he said slowly, "we would be looking at a threat to the stability of local space-time. The entities that exist in the spaces between dimensions, they're not bound by the same physical laws that govern our reality. Even a small incursion could have cascading effects." "How small?" "A single entity, properly prepared and given sufficient time to establish itself, could theoretically convert an entire star system to its own dimensional matrix. From there, the effect would spread exponentially." Olivia's expression remained controlled, but Webb could see the fear in her eyes. She knew something that made his theoretical nightmares seem suddenly, terrifyingly real. "Dr. Webb, I need your help," she said. "I can't explain everything over an open channel, but I have evidence that someone in the highest levels of government is planning exactly what you just described." That's not possible." The safeguards only work if the people implementing them aren't the ones subverting them." Olivia leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I'm putting together a team of people with the skills and knowledge necessary to stop this. Are you in?" Webb stared at the hologram for a long moment. Everything she was saying went against logic, against the fundamental assumptions upon which Imperial society was built. But the evidence she had shared, the energy readings and dimensional distortions, painted a picture that was impossible to ignore. "Send me the coordinates," he said finally. "I'll need to retrieve some equipment from my secure storage facility." The connection ended, leaving Webb alone with the implications of what he had just agreed to. He began moving through his laboratory with practiced efficiency, selecting instruments and reference materials that might prove useful. His hands stopped on a particular volume, a journal from the Void Wars, written by one of the few survivors of the research team that had first made contact with extra-dimensional entities. The final entry, written in a shaking hand, had haunted him for years. "We thought we could control them, use their power for our own purposes. We were wrong. They don't want to conquer our universe, they want to replace it with something else entirely. Something that makes sense only to minds that have never known the warmth of sunlight or the comfort of solid matter." 3 systems away, Captain Sarah Rodriguez stood in the cargo bay of her modified transport ship, the Defiant Star, watching her crew prepare for what might be their final mission. The ship itself was a relic from the border wars, its hull scarred by plasma fire and meteor impacts, but its engines had been upgraded with military-grade components that made it faster than anything in its size class. Rodriguez had received Chen's message while her crew was taking on supplies at a trading post in the Vega sector. The invitation to a private meeting had been carefully worded, but the subtext was clear: someone with inside knowledge of Imperial operations wanted to discuss matters that couldn't be trusted to official channels. Captain, her second-in-command, a grizzled veteran named Torres, approached with a data pad. "The modifications to the sensor array are complete. If we're going to make that rendezvous, we need to leave within the hour." Rodriguez nodded, her mind still processing the implications of Chen's message. The young intelligence officer had done her homework. Her background check had been thorough enough to uncover details about the Andromeda Cluster incident that weren't in the official records. Someone with that level of access to classified information was either very well connected or very dangerous. "Torres, what do you remember about the Void Wars?" she asked. The older man's expression darkened. "I was just a kid when they ended, but my grandfather served in the final campaigns. He used to tell stories, things that didn't make it into the history books. Entire fleets disappearing without a trace, planets found with their populations intact but changed somehow, speaking in languages that hurt to hear." "Did he ever mention anything about the High Command? Suspicions about who was really behind the conflict?" "He thought there were people in the government who knew more than they let on. Said the war ended too quickly, too cleanly, like someone had just flipped a switch. But that was just old soldier paranoia, right?" Rodriguez wasn't so sure. Her own experience with Imperial command structure had taught her that the truth was often very different from the official narrative. The Andromeda Cluster mission had been presented as a routine inspection of abandoned research facilities, but what they had found there suggested a much darker purpose. "Prep the ship for departure," she ordered. "And Torres? Make sure the weapon systems are fully charged." On the monastery world of Serenity Prime, SciFi knelt in meditation before an altar dedicated to the memory of those who had fallen fighting the darkness between the stars. The former Inquisitor's scaled hide, a legacy of his draconian heritage, gleamed in the light of ceremonial candles as he contemplated the message he had received. The Arcane Inquisition had been disbanded officially 3 years ago, its mission declared complete after the last known practitioner of dark magic had been eliminated. But SciFi had seen the reports, read between the lines of sanitized intelligence briefings. The darkness hadn't been destroyed, it had simply learned to hide more effectively. Chen's message had been cryptic, but the energy signatures she had attached were unmistakable. Somewhere in the galaxy, someone was working with the same forces that had nearly consumed civilization during the Void Wars. The fact that an intelligence officer had detected the signs meant that whoever was responsible was either careless or confident enough in their protection to operate more openly. Neither possibility boded well for the Empire. SciFi rose from his meditative position and moved through the monastery's ancient corridors to his private chambers. Hidden behind a false wall was a collection of weapons and artifacts that technically should have been destroyed when the Inquisition was disbanded. But some tools were too valuable to discard, especially when the threats they were designed to combat might one day return. His fingers closed around the hilt of his ancestral blade, a weapon forged in the heart of a dying star and tempered with the essence of pure faith. The metal hummed with barely contained energy, responding to his emotional state. If Chen was right, if the darkness was indeed stirring again, then he would need every advantage he could muster. The journey to the rendezvous point would take him through Imperial space, past checkpoints and sensor arrays that might detect the illegal artifacts in his possession. But some risks were worth taking, especially when the alternative was allowing ancient evils to return unopposed. He began packing with the methodical precision of someone who had done this many times before, selecting items that would be useful in a confrontation with forces beyond normal understanding. As he worked, he couldn't shake the feeling that this mission would be different from those that had come before, not just another hunt for rogue cultists or misguided scholars, but a confrontation with the fundamental nature of reality itself. The monastery's bells chimed midnight as SciFi's shuttle lifted off from the landing pad, its destination coordinates locked into the navigation system. Behind him, the lights of Serenity Prime faded into the distance, leaving only the cold stars to witness his departure. In her apartment on the galactic capital, Olivia Chen stared out at the city lights and tried to convince herself that she had made the right decision. In a few hours, she would meet with the 3 individuals who represented her best hope of stopping Thorn's plan. They were strangers, united only by their shared expertise and their reasons to distrust the current order. But as she watched the traffic streams flowing between the towering spires, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Somewhere in the shadows of the city, forces were stirring that had been dormant for generations. The convergence that Thorn had spoken of was approaching, and she was the only one who knew what it meant. The fate of trillions hung in the balance, dependent on the choices of 4 individuals who had never met. It should have been terrifying, but instead, Olivia felt a strange sense of calm. For the first time in months, she knew exactly what she had to do. The real battle was about to begin. The abandoned mining station drifted in the shadow of asteroid XK739, its hull pocked with micrometeorite impacts and its solar arrays long since stripped by salvagers. To any passing patrol, it would appear to be just another piece of space debris in the crowded asteroid belt, exactly what Olivia had hoped when she selected it as their meeting place. The Defiant Star sensor array painted the derelict station in ghostly blue on the main display as Captain Rodriguez maneuvered her ship toward the docking bay. The facility had been abandoned for nearly a decade, but its atmospheric processors were still functional, maintained by automated systems that had outlasted their human operators. Picking up 2 other ships, Torres reported from the sensor station. One's running a modified civilian transponder, but the drive signature suggests military-grade engines. The other. I've never seen anything like it. Rodriguez nodded grimly. Chen had chosen their meeting place well, isolated enough to avoid unwanted attention, but with enough sensor interference from the asteroid field to mask their presence from long-range scans. Take us in, she ordered. And keep the weapons powered but not targeted. I don't want to appear hostile, but I'm not taking any chances either. The docking bay's magnetic clamps engaged with a metallic thud that resonated through the ship's hull. As the airlock cycled, Rodriguez found herself wondering if she was walking into a trap. Chen's message had been convincing, but intelligence operatives were trained to be persuasive. For all she knew, this was an elaborate setup designed to identify and eliminate potential dissidents. The station's corridors were dim, lit only by emergency lighting that cast long shadows between the bulkheads. The air recycling system hummed with the steady rhythm of machinery that had been designed to operate for decades without maintenance, but there was an underlying staleness that spoke of a facility slowly dying. Rodriguez found the others waiting in what had once been the station's central conference room. The circular chamber was dominated by a holographic projector that flickered occasionally, creating brief glimpses of stellar charts and mining surveys from years past. Lieutenant Commander Chen looked younger than her photograph, but there was a weight in her eyes that spoke of someone who had seen too much too quickly. She stood beside a man in his 50s whose wild hair and intense gaze marked him immediately as an academic, Dr. Webb, presumably. The third figure was more imposing, a tall humanoid with scaled skin and predatory features that marked him as one of the draconian species. Captain Rodriguez, Chen stepped forward, offering her hand. Thank you for coming. I know this all seems irregular, but I believe you'll understand once you hear what I have to tell you. I'm here, Rodriguez replied, shaking the offered hand. But I'll reserve judgment until I know what I'm getting into. Chen nodded to the others. Dr. Marcus Webb, dimensional physicist. SciFi, former arcane inquisitor. We all have our reasons for being here, and I suspect we all have our doubts. But what I'm about to show you will change everything. She activated the holographic projector, and the air above the conference table shimmered into a 3-dimensional map of the galaxy. Red indicators marked dozens of locations throughout Imperial space, forming a pattern that was almost hypnotic in its complexity. These are the sites where my department has detected anomalous energy readings over the past 6 months, Chen began. Individually, they might be dismissed as sensor malfunctions or natural phenomena. But when you analyze them as a collective pattern, the display shifted, showing energy flow lines connecting the various points. The resulting image looked disturbingly organic, like a vast neural network spreading across the galaxy. It's a summoning circle, SciFi said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent years studying such things. But on a scale I've never imagined possible. Webb leaned forward, his scientific curiosity overriding his caution. The energy requirements alone would be staggering. You'd need to tap into the quantum foam itself, draw power directly from the dimensional substrate. That's exactly what's happening, Chen replied. She manipulated the display, zooming in on one of the energy nodes. This is Deep Space Research Station Omega-7. According to official records, it's conducting experiments in advanced propulsion systems. But the energy signatures tell a different story. The display showed waveform analyses and spectral breakdowns that meant nothing to Rodriguez but clearly had significant meaning for the others. Webb's face had gone pale, while SciFi's hand had moved instinctively to the weapon at his side. "These readings," Webb whispered. "They're consistent with dimensional barrier degradation. Someone is literally tearing holes in reality." "Not someone," Chen said grimly. "Chancellor Thorne himself." The silence that followed was deafening. Rodriguez felt as if the deck had shifted beneath her feet, though she knew the station's artificial gravity was perfectly stable. That's impossible," Webb stammered. "Thorne has led the Council for 10 years. He's overseen the greatest period of peace and prosperity in Imperial history." "Has he?" Chen asked. "Or has he been systematically weakening our defenses while appearing to strengthen them? Look at the deployment patterns of the Imperial fleet over the past decade." The holographic display shifted again, showing the movement of military assets throughout the galaxy. When viewed in fast forward, a disturbing pattern emerged. The Empire's most powerful warships had been gradually repositioned away from the core worlds, sent to patrol distant sectors where they would be unable to respond quickly to a central threat. "It's brilliant, in a horrifying way," Rodriguez admitted. "Create the appearance of increased security while actually making the capital more vulnerable." "But vulnerable to what?" Webb asked. "Even with the fleet dispersed, the orbital defense platforms around the core worlds could repel any conventional attack." SciFi's expression was grim. "The entities that exist in the spaces between dimensions aren't bound by conventional physics. They don't need to destroy our defenses, they can simply ignore them." Chen nodded. 3 days ago, I witnessed Thorne communing with something that spoke of a coming convergence. Whatever he's planning, it's designed to allow extra-dimensional entities into our reality on a massive scale." "But why?" Rodriguez demanded. "What could he possibly gain from destroying the empire he rules?" "Power," SciFi said simply. "The kind of power that transcends physical reality. During the Void Wars, there were humans who served the entities willingly, believing they would be rewarded with immortality and dominion over lesser beings." Webb was studying the energy pattern display with growing alarm. "If I'm reading this correctly, the convergence points are arranged in a specific geometric configuration. It's based on theoretical models I've seen before, patterns that would create a stable conduit between dimensions." "How stable?" Chen asked. "Permanent," Webb replied quietly. "Once opened, a conduit of this magnitude couldn't be closed from our side. We'd need to shut down the energy sources feeding it, and based on what you've shown me, those sources are scattered across half the galaxy." Rodriguez felt a cold knot forming in her stomach. "How long do we have?" Chen manipulated the display to show energy accumulation curves over time. "Based on current rates of increase, I estimate we have perhaps 2 weeks before the convergence reaches critical mass." 2 weeks to save the galaxy," Rodriguez muttered. "No pressure." "It's not just about saving the galaxy," SciFi interjected. "The entities Thorne is trying to summon don't just destroy, they corrupt. Every world they touch becomes a node in their network, every mind they encounter becomes an extension of their will. If they succeed here, they'll have a foothold to spread to other galaxies, other dimensions." The weight of that revelation settled over the group like a shroud. They weren't just facing the end of the Empire, they were confronting a threat to existence itself. "So what do we do?" Webb asked. "For people against the most powerful man in the galaxy and his extra-dimensional allies?" "The odds are irrelevant," Chen interrupted. "We're the only ones who know what's really happening. If we don't act, no one will." Rodriguez found herself nodding. It was the same logic that had driven her throughout her military career. When innocent lives were at stake, the odds didn't matter. You did what needed to be done, regardless of the cost. "What's the plan?" she asked. Chen activated a new display, showing detailed schematics of the galactic capital and the surrounding space. "Thorne is coordinating the convergence from the Council Tower. The building contains the most advanced communication arrays in the galaxy, capable of sending signals to every corner of Imperial space simultaneously. So we need to get inside the most heavily defended building in the Empire and confront the most powerful man in the galaxy, Webb summarized. This keeps getting better. It's not impossible, SciFi said. During my time with the Inquisition, I participated in several operations against defended positions. The key is not to fight your way through the defenses, but to make them irrelevant. Chen smiled for the first time since the meeting began. Exactly what I was thinking. But first, we need to understand exactly what we're dealing with. Dr. Webb, I need you to analyze the energy patterns more thoroughly. Find us the weak points in Thorne's network. Captain Rodriguez, we'll need transportation that can avoid Imperial sensor networks. Can your ship handle that? Rodriguez grinned. The Defiant Star was built to smuggle supplies through enemy blockades. We'll get you wherever you need to go. And SciFi, I need to know everything the Inquisition learned about combating extra-dimensional entities. If we're going to face these things, we need to know how to hurt them. The former Inquisitor nodded grimly. I brought what weapons and artifacts I could carry. But fighting the entities themselves will be only part of the challenge. The real battle will be against Thorne and whatever corrupted humans serve him. Chen looked around the table at her unlikely allies, a disgraced physicist, a court-martialed soldier, and a warrior monk from a disbanded order. It wasn't much of an army, but it was what she had to work with. Then we're agreed, she said. We stop Thorne, prevent the convergence, and save the Empire. Any questions? Webb raised his hand hesitantly. Just one. What do we do if we're wrong? What if Thorne isn't the traitor you think he is? Chen's expression hardened. Then we'll have committed treason against the most powerful man in the galaxy, and we'll probably be executed for it. But if we're right and we do nothing, there won't be a galaxy left to commit treason against. The logic was unassailable, even if the implications were terrifying. One by one, they nodded their agreement, sealing a pact that would either save civilization or condemn them all. As they began planning their infiltration of the Council Tower, none of them noticed the small maintenance drone that had been observing them from a ventilation grate. Its optical sensors recorded every word, every gesture, every detail of their conspiracy against the Chancellor. In his private chambers, Mordecai Thorne smiled as he reviewed the drone's transmission. The pawns were moving exactly as the prophecy had foretold. Soon, very soon, the final phase of his plan could begin. The Defiant Star dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Sol system, its stealth generators already engaged to mask its approach to the galactic capital. From the bridge, Rodriguez watched the sensor displays as traffic control beacons painted their position with scanning beams, each one a potential threat to their mission. Stealth holding steady, Torres reported from his station. But we can't maintain it indefinitely. The power drain is significant. Rodriguez nodded, her attention focused on the tactical display. The capital world hung before them like a jewel, its surface glowing with the light of billions of inhabitants who had no idea their lives hung in the balance. Surrounding it was a defensive network of orbital platforms, patrol ships, and automated sensor arrays that made it one of the most heavily fortified positions in the galaxy. Dr. Webb, how are those calculations coming? She called over her shoulder. The physicist looked up from his portable computer, his eyes red-rimmed from exhaustion. I've identified 17 critical nodes in Thorne's energy network. If we can disrupt even half of them simultaneously, it should cause a cascade failure that will prevent the convergence. The problem, SciFi interjected from his position near the weapons locker, is that most of those nodes are on different worlds, some of them weeks away at maximum hyperspace velocity. Chen activated the holographic display, showing the network of energy patterns they had identified. That's why we need to strike at the source. Thorne is coordinating everything from the Council Tower. If we can stop him, the entire network collapses. Assuming he doesn't have contingencies in place, Webb pointed out. A plan this elaborate must have multiple failsafes. Then we'll deal with those as we encounter them, Chen replied. Right now, Our primary objective is getting inside the tower without triggering every security system in the capital. Rodriguez had been studying the approach vectors for the past hour, looking for a route that would take them past the orbital defenses without raising alarms. The tower's location in the heart of the governmental district made it virtually impossible to approach directly, but there might be another way. What if we don't try to sneak in, she suggested. The tower receives supply deliveries around the clock, food, equipment, personnel transfers. If we could intercept one of those shipments, replace the crew and pose as legitimate visitors, Chen finished. It could work, but the security screening for tower personnel is extensive. They use everything from biometric scans to telepathic probes. SciFi smiled grimly, his scaled features taking on a predatory cast. The Inquisition developed countermeasures for most standard security systems. I brought some specialized equipment that should allow us to pass basic screening. What about the telepathic probes? Webb asked nervously. Mental disciplines, combined with certain chemical enhancers, SciFi replied. Uncomfortable but effective. The key is to think about mundane concerns while maintaining deeper focus on the mission parameters. Rodriguez pulled up the shipping manifests for the next 6 hours, looking for a suitable target. There's a supply convoy scheduled to arrive in 3 hours, food service for the tower cafeterias. For transport ships, minimal escort, standard approach vector. How many crew members? Chen asked. 12 total, plus the escort pilots. We'd need to take them alive and unharmed if we want to maintain the deception. Leave that to me, SciFi said. I have non-lethal options that will incapacitate them without causing permanent harm. They spent the next hour refining their plan, identifying potential complications and developing contingencies. The margin for error was virtually non-existent. Once they committed to the infiltration, there would be no turning back. As they prepared to intercept the supply convoy, Chen found herself thinking about the conversation she had overheard between Thorne and the extra-dimensional entity. The thing had spoken of a prophecy, of her role as someone who would stand against the darkness. The idea that cosmic forces might be influencing events was both terrifying and oddly comforting. If there was indeed some greater design at work, then perhaps their desperate mission had a chance of success. The interception went smoothly. SciFi's specialized weapons rendered the supply crew unconscious within minutes, and Rodriguez's team quickly moved to secure their ships and assume their identities. The biometric scramblers the former Inquisitor provided were works of art, disguising their heat signatures and genetic markers with technology that bordered on the supernatural. Remember, Chen said as they approached the tower's docking bay, were kitchen staff reporting for the evening shift. Tired, bored, focused on getting through another day of mindless work. The security personnel see hundreds of people like us every day. The tower's docking control guided them to their assigned berth, and the massive bulk of the governmental complex loomed around them like a technological mountain. From the inside, it was even more impressive, soaring atriums, holographic art displays, and streams of personnel moving with the purposeful efficiency of a well-oiled machine. The security checkpoint was exactly as intimidating as Chen had expected. Armed guards and powered armor flanked scanning devices that analyzed everything from DNA to quantum resonance patterns. But SciFi's countermeasures held, and within minutes they were through the checkpoint and into the tower's main circulation areas. Now comes the hard part, Chen murmured as they made their way toward the service elevators. We need to reach Thorne's private levels without arousing suspicion. Webb, who had been studying the tower's architectural plans during their approach, pointed toward a maintenance corridor. The building's internal systems are all centralized. If we can access the main computer core, I might be able to create a diversion that will draw security away from the upper levels. What kind of diversion? Rodriguez asked. Nothing dramatic, just enough minor system failures to make it look like routine maintenance is needed. A climate control malfunction here, a lighting problem there. The kind of issues that require immediate attention but don't suggest hostile action. They made their way through the tower's service areas, past bustling kitchens and humming machinery spaces that kept the massive structure operational. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. It wasn't just the weight of concrete and steel above them, there was something else, a presence that seemed to press against their minds with malevolent intent. "Do you feel that?" SciFi asked quietly, his hand moving to the hilt of his sword. "The temperature's dropping," Rodriguez observed, her breath beginning to mist in the suddenly frigid air. Chen nodded grimly. "It's getting stronger as we get closer to Thorn's chambers. Whatever he's summoning, it's already beginning to manifest." Webb's portable computer chimed softly, displaying readings that made his face go pale. "The dimensional barriers in this area are critically thin. We're looking at microfractures in local spacetime. Can you access the computer core from here?" Chen asked. Webb activated his interface device, and lines of code began scrolling across his screen. "I'm in, but the security is more sophisticated than I expected. It's going to take me at least 10 minutes to create a believable system failure pattern." "We don't have 10 minutes, Rodriguez said, studying her tactical display. "Patrol patterns show security sweeps every 8 minutes in this sector." SciFi moved to the corridor entrance, his enhanced senses scanning for threats. "I can buy us time, but not indefinitely. Once we start moving toward the upper levels, we'll be committed." Chen made the decision that would define the rest of their mission. "Do it. Webb, get us that diversion. Rodriguez, prepare your team for rapid movement. SciFi, watch our backs." As Webb's fingers flew over his keyboard, the tower's systems began to experience seemingly random failures. Climate control units in distant sections reported temperature fluctuations. Lighting grids flickered on several floors. Elevator systems required diagnostic routines. None of it was dangerous or dramatic, but it was exactly the kind of cascade failure that would require immediate attention from maintenance teams. Security personnel began receiving reports from across the facility, their attention drawn away from routine patrols to coordinate repair efforts. "That's our window," Chen said as emergency technicians hurried past their hiding spot. "Move." They made their way through service corridors and maintenance shafts, following routes that Webb had identified during his analysis of the tower's blueprints. The dimensional distortions grew stronger as they climbed, manifesting as cold spots, areas where shadows moved independently of their sources, and corridors where the geometry seemed subtly wrong. "We're close," SciFi announced, consulting a specialized detector that measured supernatural activity. "The entity's influence is strongest directly above us." They emerged from the service areas onto the executive level, where the tower's most powerful occupants maintained their offices and private chambers. The decor here was luxurious but somehow oppressive, as if the very walls absorbed light and hope in equal measure. Thorn's chambers occupied the entire top floor, accessible only through a single elevator that required special authorization codes. But Webb had anticipated this obstacle, and his infiltration of the tower's computer systems had provided them with temporary access credentials. As the elevator rose toward their destination, Chen felt the weight of destiny settling around her shoulders. In a few minutes, they would confront the most powerful man in the galaxy and attempt to prevent an apocalypse that most people didn't even know was coming. The elevator doors opened to reveal a scene from a nightmare. Thorn's chambers had been transformed into a ritual space that seemed to exist partially outside normal reality. The walls were covered with symbols that hurt to look at directly, inscribed in substances that glowed with their own inner light. At the center of the room stood the Chancellor himself, his arms raised in supplication to something that hung in the air above him like a tear in the fabric of existence. Through that dimensional rift came the whispers of entities older than starlight, beings of pure malevolence that had waited eons for this moment. Their influence was already beginning to seep into the physical world, manifesting as shadows that moved with predatory intelligence in areas where the laws of physics seemed negotiable. "Chancellor Thorn," Chen called out, her voice steady despite the cosmic horror unfolding before them. "By the authority of the Imperial Intelligence Corps, you are under arrest for treason against the Empire." Thorn turned to face them, and Chen saw that whatever humanity he had once possessed was long gone. His eyes were windows into the same dimensional void that hung above them, and when he spoke, it was with voices that belonged to things that should not exist. "Lieutenant Commander Chen," he said, his tone conversational despite the circumstances. Right on schedule. The prophecy spoke truly, you have indeed come to stand against the darkness. Then you know why we're here, SciFi said, drawing his sword. The blade ignited with holy fire that pushed back the encroaching shadows. Stand down, Thorn. Release your hold on the dimensional barriers. Thorn laughed, and the sound was like breaking glass mixed with screaming wind. You still don't understand, do you? This isn't about destroying the Empire, it's about transforming it into something greater. Something that can survive what's coming. What's coming? Webb demanded, his scientific instruments registering energy levels that should have been impossible. The Great Convergence, Thorn replied. When all realities become one, and the barriers between dimensions finally fall. Humanity can either be consumed by the change or embrace it. I choose transformation. The rift above them pulsed with malevolent energy, and something vast began to push through from the other side. Chen realized with growing horror that they might already be too late. The convergence was beginning, and once it reached critical mass, there would be no stopping it. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm her, she remembered the entity's words about prophecy and destiny. If cosmic forces were truly at work, then perhaps their mission still had meaning. Drawing her weapon, she prepared to face the darkness that threatened to consume everything she held dear. The dimensional rift tore wider as something immense began forcing its way through from the space between worlds. The air in Thorn's chamber crackled with energies that made reality itself seem fragile, like a soap bubble stretched to its breaking point. Frost spread across every surface as the temperature plummeted far below what should have been survivable, yet somehow they all remained conscious and mobile. The primary entity, SciFi whispered, his sword blazing brighter as it responded to the growing supernatural threat. I've seen references to it in the forbidden texts. They call it the Devourer of Lights. Thorn's transformed features twisted into something that might have been a smile. Indeed. The first and greatest of its kind, the herald of the new age. Through it, the boundaries between realities will dissolve, and existence itself will be redefined. Chen raised her weapon, though she suspected conventional arms would be useless against what they were facing. Dr. Webb, tell me you found a way to collapse that rift. Webb's hands flew over his portable computer, analyzing energy patterns and quantum fluctuations with desperate intensity. The dimensional breach is being held open by a complex network of resonance generators positioned throughout the galaxy. But there's something else, the rift itself is becoming self-sustaining as the entity passes through. Then we stop it here, Rodriguez said, moving to flank Thorn's position. Her military training told her to secure the hostile, but every instinct screamed that they were facing something beyond human comprehension. The creature pushing through the rift was impossible to describe in terms that human minds could process. It existed in more dimensions than the local space-time could accommodate, appearing as a constantly shifting mass of angles and surfaces that folded back on themselves in ways that violated basic geometry. Where its essence touched the physical world, matter began to change, taking on properties that belonged to some other universe entirely. You cannot stop what has already begun, Thorn said, his voice now carrying harmonics that resonated in frequencies beyond normal hearing. The convergence points are active across the galaxy. Even if you somehow manage to close this rift, others would open to compensate. SciFi stepped forward, his blade held in a defensive position that suggested decades of training in supernatural combat. Every entity has weaknesses. Every corruption can be cleansed. What anchors it to our reality? Thorn's laugh was like the sound of reality tearing. I do. My will, shaped and strengthened by years of communion with the powers beyond the veil. As long as I maintain the connection, the entity can continue to manifest. Chen saw the tactical situation with sudden clarity. The creature itself might be beyond their ability to harm, but Thorn was still human, or at least had been human once. If they could sever his connection to the entity, they might be able to collapse the rift before the convergence reached the point of no return. Take him down, she ordered, raising her weapon. But Thorn was no longer just a corrupt politician. The entity's influence had transformed him into something far more dangerous. He gestured, and the shadows in the room came alive, reaching out with tendrils of pure darkness that moved faster than thought. Rodriguez dove to one side, feeling the cold touch of otherworldly malice brush past her cheek. Her return fire sparked harmlessly off a barrier of crystallized space-time that surrounded Thorn like armor. SciFi's sword carved through the attacking shadows, each stroke leaving trails of purifying fire that pushed back the encroaching darkness. But for every tendril he destroyed, two more took its place. The symbols on the walls, Webb shouted over the rising howl of interdimensional winds. They're focusing conduits for the entity's power. If we can disrupt them. He never finished the sentence. One of the shadow tendrils wrapped around his throat, lifting him off the ground with inhuman strength. His computer clattered to the floor as he clawed desperately at the thing that was slowly strangling him. Chen's training took over. She shifted her weapon setting to maximum dispersal and fired directly at the nearest wall symbol. The energy bolt struck the glowing inscription and was absorbed harmlessly, but the symbol's light flickered momentarily. "They're not invulnerable," she called out. "But we need more firepower." Rodriguez was already moving, pulling specialized demolition charges from her equipment pack. "Everyone clear the north wall," she shouted, priming the explosives. "This is going to get messy." The charges detonated with a roar that shook the entire tower, blasting apart a section of wall and the focusing symbols inscribed on it. Immediately, the dimensional rift began to fluctuate, its edges becoming less stable as the energy matrix supporting it was disrupted. The entity's roar of rage was felt rather than heard, a vibration that passed through bone and nerve tissue without troubling the air between. Several more shadow tendrils lashed out, but now they moved with less coordination, as if the creature's connection to the physical world had been weakened. SciFi took advantage of the disruption to strike directly at Thorn, his blade blazing with concentrated faith and determination. The sword passed through the dimensional barrier surrounding the corrupt Chancellor, drawing a howl of pain that came from both human and inhuman throats. "Impossible," Thorn gasped, black ichor streaming from the wound in his chest. "The entity's protection should have been absolute." "Your entity draws its power from despair and hopelessness," SciFi replied, pressing his attack. "But we carry something it cannot understand or corrupt, the willing sacrifice of everything we hold dear for the sake of others." Thorn raised his hands, and the remaining wall symbols flared with renewed intensity. The dimensional rift stabilized, and more of the creature began forcing its way through. But now Chen could see the strain the effort was causing. Maintaining the connection was consuming Thorn's life force at an accelerating rate. "He can't keep this up indefinitely," she realized. "The entity is killing him even as it uses him." Webb, having freed himself from the shadow tendril, crawled toward his fallen computer. "If we can overload the remaining focusing symbols simultaneously, the feedback might be enough to sever his connection entirely." "How?" Rodriguez demanded, reloading her weapon with armor-piercing rounds. "Sympathetic resonance," Webb explained, his fingers dancing over the keyboard despite the chaos around them. "Every symbol is tuned to the same base frequency. If I can generate a harmonic cancellation wave." The entity chose that moment to push more of its bulk through the rift, and reality screamed in protest. The floor began to buckle as local gravity fluctuated wildly. Equipment throughout the chamber sparked and failed as electromagnetic fields twisted into impossible configurations. Chen felt something fundamental shift in her perception, as if she was seeing the world through multiple sets of eyes simultaneously. The entity's presence was poisoning local space-time, creating zones where the normal laws of physics became suggestions rather than absolute rules. "Whatever you're going to do, do it now," she shouted to Webb. The physicist's equipment hummed with building energy as he prepared to broadcast the harmonic cancellation wave. But before he could activate it, Thorn struck back with the full power of his otherworldly patron. The remaining shadows in the room coalesced into a single massive form, a pseudopod of pure malevolence that reached out toward Webb's position. SciFi moved to intercept, but he was too far away. Rodriguez fired everything she had, but conventional weapons passed harmlessly through the shadow construct. It seemed certain that Webb would be crushed before he could complete his work. Then Chen did something that would have been impossible moments before, when the laws of physics still held absolute sway. She reached out with her mind and grasped the shadow tendril, holding it back through pure force of will. The contact burned like ice and fire combined, but she held on, drawing strength from the knowledge that billions of lives hung in the balance. "Now, Webb," she screamed, pouring everything she had into maintaining her grip on the otherworldly construct. The harmonic cancellation wave erupted from Webb's equipment with the force of a sonic boom. Every remaining symbol on the walls flared brilliantly, then went dark as the focusing matrix collapsed. The dimensional rift shuddered, its edges beginning to contract as the energy supporting it was cut off. But the entity was not willing to be banished so easily. It lashed out with its remaining strength, and Chen felt her mental hold on the shadow construct begin to slip. The creature was trying to anchor itself to her consciousness, to use her as a new conduit to maintain its foothold in reality. "I won't let you," she whispered, feeling the thing's alien thoughts pressing against her mind like acid. "I won't let you destroy everything." Thorn's scream of rage and despair echoed through the chamber as his connection to the entity was severed. Without his will to anchor it, the creature began sliding back through the dimensional rift, its roars of frustration fading as it was pulled into the space between worlds. But even as victory seemed within reach, Chen realized that something had gone wrong. The entity's desperate attempt to anchor itself to her mind had created a new connection, one that was growing stronger by the second. She could feel her consciousness being drawn toward the dimensional void, pulled inexorably toward a fate that would make Thorn's corruption seem like a mercy. "Chen!" Rodriguez shouted, reaching out toward her. "Fight it!" "I'm trying," Chen gasped, feeling her sense of self beginning to dissolve. The entity's alien thoughts were flooding her mind, showing her visions of realities where the very concept of individual existence was meaningless. "But it's too strong." Zephai's sword blazed brighter than ever as he reversed his grip and offered it to her hilt first. "Take it," he said urgently. "The blade carries the faith of 1,000 generations of warriors who stood against the darkness. Let their strength become yours." Chen's hands closed around the sword's hilt, and immediately she felt the presence of countless souls who had faced similar choices throughout history. Their combined will formed a barrier around her consciousness, holding back the entity's influence long enough for her to act. With the last of her strength, she turned the blade on herself. But instead of piercing her heart, the sword passed through her body as if she were made of light, severing the psychic connection that bound her to the creature without causing physical harm. The entity's final scream of rage and frustration was cut short as the dimensional rift collapsed entirely, sealing the breach between worlds. Silence fell over the chamber like a physical weight. Thorn's body lay crumpled on the floor, aged decades in the span of minutes by the forces he had tried to control. The walls were scarred and blackened where the focusing symbols had been, but the oppressive sense of otherworldly presence was gone. "Is it over?" Webb asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Chen looked around at her companions, exhausted, wounded, but alive. Through the shattered windows of the chamber, the lights of the galactic capital sparkled peacefully, unaware of how close they had come to extinction. "This part is," she replied. But Webb was right about the network being galaxy-wide. There are still convergence points out there, still research stations conducting experiments with forces they don't understand. Rodriguez nodded grimly. "Then we have work to do." As they prepared to leave the chamber, Chen couldn't shake the feeling that their victory, though real, was also incomplete. The entity she had faced was old and powerful, but it had spoken of others, of a great convergence that would eventually come regardless of their efforts. But that was a problem for another day. For now, the Empire was safe, and the darkness had been pushed back into the spaces between the stars where it belonged. It would have to be enough.